Following the Bronze Age collapse, there was a period of post-collapse. New cultures developed, new polities emerged, new identities were formed. Over the course of what we know as the Iron Age, developed what we tend to think of as the first in a long string of empires which dominated the Western world. But this transition from the Iron Age to the Age of Empires was far from seamless. In fact, some scholars talk about a 6th century collapse. But what evidence is there for it? Does it even qualify as an episode of collapse? And why does it matter? Let's dig in. Mario Liverani is a historian of the ancient Near East. He has argued that beginning with the decline of the Assyrian Empire until the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire, the Near East saw a period of decline. He refers to this as the 6th century, but I think a term like the long 7th century may be better. Because centuries are arbitrary, historians will often refer to a period of approximately 100 years as a quote-unquote long century. For example, the long 12th century is often used to refer to the period between the First Crusade in the 1090s up until sometime in the 1220s. The long 19th century is used to refer to the period between the French Revolution and the end of the First World War. So a long 7th century is not a new or foreign idea. In fact, a long 7th century has already been proposed and discussed in the academic literature. When the long 7th century begins, though, depends on where you are. This is because what characterizes the long 7th century is encounters with Mesopotamian imperial powers. This happens for different polities at different times, and it ends when regions are brought into the Achaemenid Empire, which again varies from place to place. This is what Mario Liverani refers to in his discussion of a 6th century collapse, the period in the Near East when non-Mesopotamian regions encounter and are impacted by Mesopotamian imperialism, first by the Neo-Assyrians and then the Chaldean Babylonian Empire. Liverani is also quick to acknowledge that the experience of collapse was highly variable from region to region. Now, collapse is a largely endogenous process. That is, societies develop internally to a point where they become fragile or susceptible to collapse. Usually after some sort of triggering mechanism, which may be either internal or external, the process of collapse unfolds, which has a number of archaeologically identifiable features. Based on the literature on collapse, I've developed my own trait list that characterizes a society that is experiencing or has experienced collapse. Now, this is a bit like when you're sick and you go to the doctor. You may have a number of symptoms of a particular illness, but won't manifest with all of them. So too with collapse. The society may not check off every single one of these, but you can still look at it and say there's enough to say this society has experienced a significant trauma and we can call it collapse. So what actually happened during this period? Following the Bronze Age collapse, several secondary states emerged throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in places where the Bronze Age empires had dominated. In Anatolia, the Phrygian kingdom emerged shortly after 1200, and by the mid-9th century, Phrygia was at its military and economic peak. The story of its wealth are retained in myths of the famed King Midas, suggested to be Mita from Assyrian sources, and this wealth is attested archaeologically at the site of Gordion, the capital of Phrygia. Phrygia apparently had secured peace with Assyria, but Assyria did not come to Phrygia's aid when they were invaded by Cimmerians. By 675, Gordion was destroyed and the independent kingdom of Phrygia was gone. In modern-day Armenia, the kingdom of Urartu was already forming by the 13th century BC. By the 9th century, Urartu was a large regional power. By the 8th century, it was one of the largest states in the Near East. In the late 8th century, campaigns by Sargon II, as well as attacks by Cimmerians, left Urartu largely defeated and the kingdom began a long period of decline. Over the course of the 7th century, Urartu continued to shrink in influence. Urartian history becomes muddled as the records are not clear, which is itself an indication of decline, but by 590, Urartu ceased to be an independent kingdom. Archaeologically, it appears many of Urartu's cities were destroyed by fire, though it's not clear what is responsible for the destruction in each case. Urartu had a network of hilltop fortresses to maintain communication and travel through the rugged region around Lake Van, but these too were either burned or abandoned by the end of the 7th century. In Iran, the kingdom of the Manians emerged suddenly in the 9th century and had reached the height of its power and influence in the late 8th century. Sargon II subjugated them in the late 8th century though, and they remained an Assyrian client state. They rebelled in the late 7th century but were again subjugated. They were ultimately defeated by the Medes in the 6th century and ceased to exist as an independent polity. Even the Medes suffer in this period, right as they begin to be an ascendant power in the region. Several fortresses and apparent ceremonial centers are abandoned, though this may be more reflective of political centralization and consolidation, where tribal strongholds are forcibly abandoned and subjugated to a centralized state or leader, rather than indicative of decline. Something significant happened in Media in the mid to late 7th century which led to a more coherent and unified region, but what that process looked like isn't immediately clear. This Iron III period is generally not well known in northwestern Iran. Elam suffers significant abandonment during this period called the Neo-Elamite II period. Ashurbanipal looted Susa in 647, which is traditionally dated as the end of Elamite civilization, but this may be overstated. Susa remained influential, at least symbolically, well into the 6th century, but the mountainous region around it apparently suffered a serious episode of abandonment. In Syria, the Aramean and Luwian-speaking polities, variously called Neo-Hittite, Syro-Hittite, Neo-Assyrian, Aramean Luwian, Luwian Aramean, Syrian Anatolian, or post-Hittite, suffer what appeared to be collapse in the 7th century. Carchemish was made an Assyrian province by Sargon II in the late 8th century, whereafter it ceased to be a city of any real importance. It was the site of a significant battle in 605, but the city had ceased to be of any consequence long before that. Melid, to the north of Carchemish, was likewise sacked by Sargon II, and the area was subsequently ravaged by nomadic tribes from north of the Caucasus, and the region declined in importance. The city of Kumo had a similar story. Sargon conquered it in 708, but the city and the region declined. Samal, or Yediya, was incorporated as a vassal of Assyria by the time of Sargon II, but between 676 and 671, the palace at Zinchirli was burned and a new administrative complex was built. The city was abandoned by 612. There's no evidence for destruction, more like an intentional abandonment where the people took their belongings and fled. Polities further to the south like Hamat, Damascus, Israel, and Judah all also suffered apparent episodes of collapse. Hamat organized a coalition against Sargon II consisting of Hamat, Damascus, Arpad, Samira, and Hatarika. It was decisively defeated at Karkar, the very site a similar coalition was victorious over the Assyrians over a century earlier. Yaubidi, the self-appointed king of Hamat, and his family were exiled, and he was later flayed alive. The city of Hamat was destroyed and remained a ruin until the Hellenistic period. Some 6,000 Assyrians, likely those who had caused trouble elsewhere in the empire, were exiled to Hamat. Samaria was destroyed and a large amount of Israelites were exiled. And in the 6th century, the kingdom of Judah was subjugated by the Chaldean Babylonian Empire. The capital city of Jerusalem was destroyed and large portions of the population were exiled. Now, when we look at these regions, the material record clearly looks like collapse. There are demographic crises, settlement patterns shift, clear reduction in the built environment. On down the list, these regions appear to have undergone collapse, particularly when we look at the polities of the southern Levant, which are well excavated and well understood. But this was not an endogenous process. This was imposed upon them. So it's not exactly a natural or true collapse, but a kind of imposed collapse. If not for encountering the imperial powers based in Mesopotamia, these more peripheral regions would not have suffered the material conditions of collapse. We can even go as far as to say that the imposition of the conditions of collapse is an epiphenomenon of mid to late Iron Age imperial policies of the Assyrian and Babylonian states. While all imperial powers prioritized the prosperity of the core at the expense of the peripheral conquered areas, this was taken to an extreme under Assyria and then especially by the Chaldeans. Imperial policies directly led to the material conditions of collapse, and only after incorporation into the Achaemenid Empire and the attendant shift in imperial policies toward peripheral regions and conquered territories do these societies begin to recover. This collapse episode was not as widespread as that of the Bronze Age, nor was it as thorough, but it was still hugely impactful. And while the collapse episodes these areas experienced was imposed on them, these societies still underwent a recognizable post-collapse recovery process. While there's a lot of interesting archaeological data here, one thing stands out as particularly impactful. One feature common in post-collapse societies is the development of a narrative of collapse. Those who survive grappling with why this tragedy befell them. What caused it? How could it be avoided? While these often tend to be curious pieces of literature of marginal global significance, that isn't always the case. For example, the 100 schools of thought during the Warring States period in China generated the philosophies of Confucius and Lao Tzu. This was an episode of collapse generating competing narratives of collapse to both explain their tragedy and a roadmap on how to avoid it that had a massive impact on the world. We see something similar in this case with the development of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. The Kingdom of Judah experienced this episode of collapse, and in their post-collapse period under the Achaemenid Empire, various texts and traditions were pulled together in part to explain what happened and why. Now, whether one accepts the theological claims of the Judeo-Christian tradition or not, it's hard to overstate how impactful their sacred texts have been on the Western tradition, and we have, in part, the Iron Age collapse to thank for it.